The stop that changed everything. The streets of Philadelphia buzzed with their usual intensity. Horns blared in chaotic rhythm. Vendors shouted to promote their wares, and distant sirens sang their ever-present melody. It was a city alive, where every corner seemed to hum with its unique energy. Officer Paul Mitchell sat in his patrol car, parked at the intersection of Broad and Market Street. His sharp blue uniform was crisp, his boots polished, and his holstered weapon visible, an image of authority. Yet behind the sharp appearance lay a man hardened by years of duty, shaped by assumptions he rarely questioned. Paul scanned the crowded street, his eyes flitting from one passerby to another. He prided himself on his vigilance, always looking for the slightest hint of suspicious activity. A vendor exchanging cash too quickly, a car pausing for too long at a stoplight. His instincts ruled his decisions, and today his attention was captured by a sleek black sedan idling near the curb. Inside the sedan sat a composed woman with dark skin, her hair styled neatly, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer. Her demeanor was calm, almost regal, as she waited for a pedestrian to cross before pulling onto the busy street. Her precision behind the wheel and her unhurried movement stood out in the city's usual chaos. To Paul, this calmness felt wrong. Too composed, he muttered, his hand already reaching for the siren switch. Let's see what's really going on here. In the driver's seat of the black sedan, Rebecca Carter adjusted her rearview mirror and noticed the flashing lights behind her. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she signaled and eased her car to the side of the road. Rebecca wasn't unfamiliar with these situations. Over the years, she'd been stopped many times, often for reasons that seemed arbitrary at best. She knew how to handle these encounters, but they never got easier. Rebecca was no ordinary driver. She was a senior agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, specializing in profiling criminal behavior. A career built on understanding people, decoding their actions, and uncovering hidden motives had given her a unique perspective. She could already anticipate how this encounter would go. The veiled hostility, the probing questions, and the lingering suspicion despite her credentials. With a deep breath, Rebecca adjusted her blazer and reached for her identification. A knock at her window drew her attention. Officer Mitchell stood outside, his face impassive but his posture radiating authority. She rolled down her window, her expression neutral yet firm. "License and registration," Mitchell said, his tone clipped. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a demand. Rebecca handed over her documents, including her FBI credentials, ensuring her badge was visible. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm but steady. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Mitchell barely glanced at the badge before flipping through the documents. "You were driving suspiciously," he said flatly, avoiding eye contact. "Just sit tight." Rebecca watched as he retreated to his patrol car. She didn't need to analyze his behavior to know what was happening. Years of experience had taught her to recognize bias when she saw it. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, her breathing steady, but her mind raced. Would he escalate this? Would he admit his mistake when he found nothing? Or would his pride push him to dig deeper? In his patrol car, Paul scanned Rebecca's documents and ran her plates through the system. Nothing came up. No warrants, no priors, not even a parking ticket. His jaw tightened. He glanced back at the sleek black car, its polished exterior gleaming in the midday sun. Paul tapped his fingers against the keyboard, feeling the weight of his mistake. He knew she wasn't doing anything illegal, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he'd overreacted. Instead, he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a situation here. Can you send backup to my location?" "Backup." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Everything okay, Officer Mitchell?" Paul hesitated. "Yeah, just precautionary." Rebecca noticed another patrol car pulling up behind Mitchell's. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment before she exhaled. She adjusted her side mirror to catch a glimpse of the second officer stepping out, a younger man with a nervous energy about him. Rebecca could tell he was new to the force, likely still learning to navigate situations like this. His eyes darted between Mitchell and the black sedan as he approached. "Paul," the younger officer said quietly as he reached Mitchell's window. "What's going on here?" Mitchell gestured vaguely toward Rebecca's car. "Suspicious driver. Something feels off." The rookie frowned, glancing at Rebecca's SUV. "She handed you her ID, right? Did you check it?" Mitchell scowled. "Of course I did." The rookie shifted uncomfortably. "And? Did you see her badge? She's FBI." Mitchell's face darkened. "I know what I'm doing, rookie. Stay out of it." The younger officer hesitated but stepped back, his expression uneasy. He'd seen enough to know something wasn't right, but he lacked the confidence to challenge his senior officer. In her car, Rebecca opened her phone and navigated to her agency's contact list. She tapped a number labeled Command Center and held the phone to her ear. "FBI Command Center," a professional voice answered. "This is Agent Ramirez." "Agent Ramirez, this is Rebecca Carter," she said, her voice steady. "I'm currently being detained by a Philadelphia police officer without cause. I need this interaction logged and monitored." "Understood, Agent Carter. Please remain on the line. We're recording now." Rebecca set her phone on speaker, ensuring the officer could hear the exchange. Through her mirror, she saw Mitchell's head snap up, his eyes narrowing as he stepped out of his car. His stiff posture and clenched fists revealed his growing frustration. He approached her window, leaning in. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "Turn that off." Rebecca met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "Officer, I'm well within my rights to document this interaction. My agency is also recording this call. If you have any objections, you can take them up with the FBI." Her calm confidence seemed to unnerve Mitchell. For the first time, he hesitated, his bluster faltering. The younger officer stood a few steps behind, his expression conflicted as he observed the exchange. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, their curiosity piqued by the flashing lights and tension in the air. Several pedestrians had their phones out, recording the scene. Rebecca could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she remained composed. "Stay here," Mitchell barked before stalking back to his patrol car. Rebecca exhaled slowly. She knew this was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The command center was listening, the crowd was watching, and the truth was on her side. As Mitchell sat in his car, furiously typing into his computer, Rebecca watched him through her rearview mirror. She could see the frustration etched on his face, the growing realization that he was out of his depth. But instead of backing down, he seemed determined to double down. A mistake she knew he'd regret. Rebecca glanced at her phone, Ramirez's voice still steady on the other end. "Agent Carter, we're monitoring. Do you need additional support on site?" "Not yet," she replied. "But stay ready. This isn't over." A fractured shield. The midday sun glinted off the windows of downtown Philadelphia's buildings, casting sharp shadows across the bustling street. Pedestrians lingered nearby, their interest captured by the escalating scene. Rebecca Carter sat silently in her sleek black sedan, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, but her mind was already processing the unfolding situation. Through her rearview mirror, she could see Officer Paul Mitchell hunched over the computer in his patrol car, his movements tense and hurried. The young rookie, Officer Ryan Cole, stood a few steps away from the second patrol car, visibly unsure of his role in the situation. Rebecca's training allowed her to read people quickly, and she recognized the rookie's internal conflict. His rigid stance and darting eyes betrayed his unease, but fear of stepping out of line held him back. The street around them buzzed with energy, but the focus of everyone nearby was squarely on Rebecca's car and the officers. Phones were out, recording every move, every word. Rebecca knew she was at the center of a moment that could escalate further or pivot toward accountability. Inside his patrol car, Mitchell's frustration reached a boiling point. He scrolled through Rebecca's record, his fingers tapping aggressively at the keyboard. But there was nothing. Clean as a whistle. No tickets, no outstanding warrants, no flight incidents. Her FBI badge and identification were genuine, something he could no longer ignore. But admitting that meant admitting he'd made a mistake, and Mitchell wasn't ready to swallow that pill. His pride, reinforced by years on the force, and an unshaken belief in his instincts, wouldn't let him back down. Mitchell glanced toward Rebecca's car, his jaw tightening as he saw her calmly waiting. She didn't look angry, scared, or defiant, just composed. That composure felt like a challenge, a quiet assertion that she was untouchable. Mitchell wasn't used to feeling powerless, and it stung. He muttered under his breath, "Let's see how untouchable she really is." Rebecca's phone buzzed softly. It was still on speaker, and Agent Ramirez's voice came through. "Agent Carter, are you still safe? Do you need assistance deployed?" "I'm safe for now," Rebecca replied, her tone even. "But I'd like you to elevate this incident to Supervisory Agent Wallace at the Philadelphia field office. Inform him that I'm requesting immediate documentation and oversight." "Understood. Stand by." Rebecca placed her phone back on the console, her expression neutral but firm. She could feel the weight of the growing crowd's eyes on her, but she maintained her composure. She was no stranger to public scrutiny, and she understood the power of perception. How she handled this situation could set the tone for what followed, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. Officer Ryan Cole shifted nervously by his cruiser, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was still new to the force, only 6 months out of the academy, and this was the kind of situation they hadn't prepared him for. Sure, there'd been classes on bias and de-escalation, but they'd been theoretical, wrapped in sanitized language that didn't fully prepare him for the reality of the streets. He glanced toward Mitchell, who was still in his car, clearly fuming. Then he looked at the woman in the SUV. Her calmness unsettled him. It wasn't the calm of someone hiding something. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly where the lines were and how not to cross them. "Mitchell," Ryan called out hesitantly, taking a few steps toward the senior officer's car. "I think we should let her go. She's FBI. Her credentials check out. There's no reason to keep her here." Mitchell whipped his head around, glaring at the rookie. "You don't tell me how to do my job, Cole." "I'm just saying," Ryan pressed, his voice faltering but steady enough to be heard. "This doesn't look right. The crowd's watching, and it's already on social media." Mitchell slammed his hand on the dashboard, his temper flaring. "I said stay out of it. You think you know better because you've got a fresh uniform. You don't know a damn thing, rookie." Ryan took a step back, his face reddening with embarrassment and frustration. He wanted to push further, but Mitchell's authority loomed large, and he felt himself retreating into silence. Rebecca watched the exchange through her side mirror, noting the rookie's hesitant body language and Mitchell's aggressive demeanor. She recognized the dynamic immediately. An older officer clinging to his authority, and a younger one grappling with the courage to speak up. It was a pattern she'd seen too many times before. Rebecca picked up her phone again, dialing a new number. The call connected after 2 rings. "This is Supervisory Agent Wallace." "Wallace, it's Rebecca Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm currently detained by Philadelphia PD without cause. I've already contacted Command Center, but I want this incident escalated." Wallace's tone shifted, his professionalism underscored by concern. "Are you safe, Agent Carter?" "I am," she replied. "But the officer in question is refusing to acknowledge my credentials and continues to detain me. The situation is drawing significant public attention. I need immediate backup." "Understood. I'll deploy a team to your location. Stay on the line." Rebecca placed the phone back on the console, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Mitchell stepped out of his car, slamming the door behind him as he approached Rebecca's vehicle, His posture was rigid, his face a mask of irritation. He leaned down toward her window, his voice low but dripping with hostility. "Turn that phone off," he demanded. "You think you can just call in the FBI and make this go away? That's not how it works." Rebecca met his gaze evenly, her voice calm. "Officer Mitchell, I've already informed my agency of this stop. They are monitoring this interaction, and I've requested backup. If you continue to detain me without cause, this will escalate beyond your control." Mitchell sneered, his frustration boiling over. "You think your badge makes you untouchable?" "No," Rebecca said evenly, "but it ensures accountability." The crowd murmured audibly, their interest heightened by the exchange. Phones captured every word, and Rebecca knew those recordings would soon be online for the world to see. Mitchell stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to regain control of the situation. He turned to Ryan, who was now standing by the second patrol car, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Cole," Mitchell barked, "get over here." Ryan approached hesitantly, his eyes darting between Mitchell and Rebecca. "Yes, sir." "Tell the crowd to disperse," Mitchell ordered, gesturing vaguely toward the onlookers. "They're interfering." Ryan hesitated. "But they're not on the road or blocking traffic. They're just watching." "Just do it," Mitchell snapped. Ryan flinched but nodded, moving toward the crowd. He raised his hands awkwardly, trying to address them. Folks, we need you to keep moving. This is a police matter." The crowd didn't budge. If anything, they seemed more emboldened, their phones still trained on the scene. Rebecca watched the exchange, her mind racing through potential outcomes. She could see Mitchell unraveling, his anger clouding his judgment. The rookie's discomfort was evident, but he seemed torn between following orders and doing what he knew was right. As the tension escalated, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Rebecca glanced toward the intersection, where two black SUVs bearing FBI insignias pulled up. Out stepped Supervisory Agent Wallace, flanked by two other agents in tailored suits. Their arrival shifted the dynamic instantly. Wallace approached the scene with a commanding presence, his expression calm but resolute. He exchanged a brief glance with Rebecca, silently confirming her safety, before turning to Mitchell. "Officer Mitchell," Wallace began, his voice steady but authoritative. "I'm Supervisory Agent Wallace with the FBI. I've been briefed on this situation. You are detaining one of my agents without probable cause. I suggest you step back immediately." Mitchell's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "This is my scene, Agent Wallace. I don't need the FBI telling me how to do my job." Wallace's expression didn't waver. "This is no longer your scene, officer. You've overstepped your authority, and this interaction is now under federal review." The crowd murmured again, their attention now divided between Wallace and Mitchell. Phones captured the moment as Mitchell's authority crumbled under the weight of Wallace's calm but unyielding presence. Rebecca exhaled softly, feeling the tension begin to ease, but she knew this was just the beginning. Accountability wouldn't end with Mitchell. It would have to reach the entire system that allowed his actions to go unchecked, and she was prepared to see it through. The gathering storm. The crowd outside the scene had swelled, spilling over into the sidewalks as murmurs rippled through the spectators like electricity. Phones stayed aloft, catching every moment, every word, every expression. Supervisory Agent Wallace, now flanked by two federal agents, stood across from Officer Paul Mitchell, whose confidence had visibly cracked under the weight of federal authority. Mitchell's rookie partner, Officer Ryan Cole, lingered on the edge of the confrontation, his face pale and conflicted. Rebecca Carter remained seated in her vehicle, her FBI badge now resting on her dashboard for everyone to see. She kept her eyes steady, watching Wallace and Mitchell like a chess master observing an opponent's faltering strategy. She could sense the tide turning, but she knew Mitchell wasn't finished. Men like him never let go easily. "Supervisory Agent Wallace," Mitchell said, his voice taut and trembling with suppressed anger. "I don't need the FBI coming down here and telling me how to do my job. I pulled her over because her driving was suspicious. Wallace folded his arms across his chest, his expression as unreadable as stone. Suspicious, he echoed, his tone calm but pointed. Please elaborate, Officer Mitchell. What exactly was suspicious about her driving? Mitchell hesitated, the weight of the crowd's attention pressing down on him. He shifted his feet, his eyes darting to the onlookers, the rookie, and finally Rebecca's vehicle. She was driving too slow, he said finally, his voice gruff, looking around like she didn't know where she was going. Wallace tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. Driving slowly isn't a crime, Officer Mitchell, and unless you observed her breaking a traffic law, your stop is unlawful. Did you? Mitchell's face reddened further. I know what I saw, he snapped, his frustration boiling over. She didn't belong here. The words hung in the air, sharp and damning. The crowd gasped audibly, their murmurs growing louder as they processed the blatant implication. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every second of Mitchell's unraveling defense. Rebecca's lips tightened in the faintest hint of a grim smile. The moment she had anticipated had arrived. Wallace's expression darkened, and he took a deliberate step closer to Mitchell, his voice dropping low, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. Didn't belong here, he repeated, his tone cold as steel. Are you suggesting that her presence in this neighborhood was justification enough to pull her over? Mitchell faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. That's not what I meant, he muttered, his bravado slipping. Then clarify, Wallace said, his tone cutting, because what I'm hearing sounds like a baseless stop rooted in bias. The crowd erupted, their voices rising in outrage and agreement. Hold him accountable. Someone shouted. This happens every day. Rebecca adjusted her rearview mirror, her gaze flickering to Officer Cole. The rookie's discomfort was evident, his posture rigid, and his eyes darting nervously between Mitchell and Wallace. Rebecca could see his internal struggle, the battle between loyalty and morality, fear and courage. He was teetering on the edge, and she decided to give him a push. Rolling down her window slightly, Rebecca called out to him, her voice steady but firm. Officer Cole. The rookie's head snapped toward her, startled. He hesitated, then took a tentative step closer. Yes, Mom. Rebecca's eyes locked onto his, her tone calm but laced with meaning. Do you believe this stop was justified? You've been here from the beginning. You know the truth. Cole froze, his face flushing. The crowd fell silent, their attention pivoting to him. Wallace turned, watching the rookie intently. Even Mitchell glanced back, his glare sharp and warning. For a moment, Cole looked like he might retreat. But then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders. No, he said, his voice trembling but audible. No, I don't think it was justified. The crowd gasped, and Mitchell whirled on him, his face a mask of fury. Cole, what the hell are you doing? I'm telling the truth, Cole said, his voice gaining strength. You stopped her because you assumed something was wrong, but there wasn't. She handed over her FBI badge, and I told you we should let her go. You ignored me. Mitchell's face twisted in rage. You don't get to throw me under the bus. Do you know how long I've been doing this job? It doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. Cole shot back, surprising even himself with his boldness. What matters is doing it right. Wallace stepped forward, placing a hand on Cole's shoulder. Thank you, Officer Cole, he said, his voice steady. It takes courage to stand up for what's right, especially in a situation like this. Cole nodded, his face pale but resolute. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing down the street. For a moment, Rebecca felt a flicker of hope, proof that even in a broken system, there were those willing to take a stand. Mitchell, however, was far from conceding. This is a setup, he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. You're all out to get me. I was just doing my job. Wallace turned back to him, his expression hard. No, Officer Mitchell. Your job is to serve and protect, not to profile and intimidate. Your actions today have undermined the trust your badge is supposed to represent." As if on cue, the arrival of another vehicle silenced the crowd. A plain, unmarked car pulled up, and out stepped two internal affairs officers. Their presence carried an air of finality. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp features and an aura of authority, approached Wallace and Mitchell. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice crisp. "I'm Lieutenant Naomi Clark with Internal Affairs. I've been briefed on this incident, and I'm here to initiate an investigation. You are officially relieved of duty pending the outcome." Mitchell's face turned ashen. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's for the investigation to determine," Clark replied coldly. "Hand over your badge and weapon." Mitchell hesitated, his hands trembling. For a moment, it seemed like he might resist, but the weight of the crowd, the cameras, and the federal agents was too much. Slowly, he unclipped his badge and weapon, handing them over to Clark. The crowd cheered, their voices a mixture of vindication and relief. Phones recorded every second as Mitchell was escorted to the Internal Affairs vehicle, his once proud demeanor shattered. Rebecca finally stepped out of her vehicle, her presence commanding attention. She straightened her blazer, her FBI badge glinting in the sunlight, and approached Wallace. "Thank you for coming, Supervisory Agent Wallace," she said, her voice steady. "And thank you, Officer Cole, for your honesty." Wallace nodded. "Agent Carter, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Rebecca replied, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But this isn't just about me. This is about accountability." Wallace's expression softened. "You handled this with grace, Rebecca. The FBI will ensure that the necessary changes are made." Rebecca nodded, but her thoughts were already turning to the bigger picture. This was just one incident, one officer. The system that allowed Mitchell to operate unchecked was still intact, and dismantling it would take more than one victory. As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca took a deep breath. This was far from over, but she was ready for the fight ahead. The storm had only just begun. Waves of accountability. The fallout from the traffic stop spread like wildfire. Within hours, videos of the encounter had gone viral, splashed across social media with hashtags like #JusticeForRebecca and #AccountabilityNow. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail of the interaction between Officer Mitchell, Rebecca Carter, and Supervisory Agent Wallace. Public opinion swirled into a storm, demanding answers and immediate reforms. Rebecca Carter sat in the conference room of the FBI's Philadelphia field office, surrounded by agents and legal representatives. The tension in the room was thick, but Rebecca's demeanor was calm as always. She had faced far more volatile situations in her career, but this one carried a unique weight. This was about more than her. It was about a broken system, a culture that allowed unchecked bias to flourish. "Agent Carter," began Wallace, seated at the head of the table. His tone was professional, but Rebecca could sense his underlying concern. "Internal Affairs has officially taken Officer Mitchell into custody for questioning. Preliminary findings suggest a pattern of behavior that goes beyond your incident." Rebecca nodded, her expression grave. "I expected as much," she said. "The arrogance he displayed didn't come from nowhere. It's the product of years without accountability." Wallace leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "The question now is how we handle this going forward. The public is watching, and they're demanding answers, not just about Mitchell, but about the larger issues this incident represents." Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. "We need to focus on transparency and systemic reform," she said. "This can't be about scapegoating one officer. The department needs to confront the culture that allowed him to operate unchecked." Another agent, seated across from Rebecca, cleared his throat. "That's easier said than done," he said. "The police union is already pushing back. They're claiming this is an isolated incident and accusing us of blowing it out of proportion." Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "Isolated? Mitchell outright admitted to profiling me because I didn't belong. That's not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for too long. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Rebecca's words sank in. Wallace broke the silence, his voice firm. She's right. This isn't just about one bad officer. This is about ensuring the public can trust law enforcement again. If we don't act decisively, we risk losing that trust altogether. Later that day, Rebecca walked into the press room of the FBI's field office, where a podium and a row of microphones awaited her. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the stage. Supervisory Agent Wallace stood beside her, along with 2 other federal agents. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anticipation and tension. Rebecca adjusted the microphone and scanned the crowd before beginning. Her voice was steady, but every word carried weight. Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Carter, and I am a senior agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Many of you are familiar with the events that transpired yesterday during a traffic stop conducted by Officer Paul Mitchell of the Philadelphia Police Department. I want to start by saying that I am not here as a victim. I am here as an advocate for accountability and justice. The room quieted further as Rebecca continued, her tone unwavering. This incident was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, a systemic problem that has allowed bias to influence policing for far too long. This is not just about me. It's about every individual who has been targeted, marginalized, or profiled based on their appearance rather than their actions. Rebecca paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Accountability must go beyond punishing one officer. It must extend to the system that enabled him. That is why I am calling for an independent review of the Philadelphia Police Department's policies, procedures, and culture. This review must be transparent and include voices from the communities most affected by these practices. A reporter raised his hand, and Rebecca nodded toward him. Agent Carter, how do you respond to critics who say you're politicizing this incident? Rebecca's gaze was piercing as she replied. Bias in policing isn't political. It's a reality. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Addressing it isn't about taking sides. It's about ensuring that every citizen, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and respect. Another reporter jumped in. What message do you hope this sends to law enforcement officers? Rebecca's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained clear. To the officers watching this, I want to say this. Integrity matters. Upholding the law means applying it equally and fairly. The badge you wear is a symbol of trust. Honor that trust by holding yourselves and each other accountable. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Officer Ryan Cole sat in a small, sterile room at Internal Affairs headquarters. A plainclothes investigator sat across from him, her pen poised over a notepad. Officer Cole, she began, her tone neutral but firm. Thank you for coming in. We've reviewed your statements from the traffic stop involving Agent Carter, and we want to commend you for your honesty. That said, we need to ask, why didn't you intervene sooner? Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I hesitated, he admitted. Mitchell was my superior, and I didn't want to overstep. But I knew what he was doing was wrong. When I saw Agent Carter's FBI credentials, I told him we should let her go, but he ignored me. The investigator nodded, jotting down notes. And how common is this behavior among your colleagues? Have you witnessed similar incidents before? Ryan hesitated, his throat tightening. He thought of the times he'd seen officers bend the rules, make assumptions, or let their biases guide their actions. He thought of the unwritten code that discouraged officers from questioning their peers. Yeah, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It happens. Not all the time, but enough that you notice. And when you're new, you don't feel like you can speak up. The investigator's pen paused. Would you be willing to testify to that if necessary? Ryan swallowed hard, his palms sweating. He thought of the potential fallout, alienating his colleagues, being labeled a traitor. But then he thought of Agent Carter, her unwavering resolve in the face of Mitchell's hostility. He thought of the crowd, cheering when Mitchell was held accountable. "Yes," he said, his voice steadying. "I would." As night fell, Rebecca sat in her office, the city lights twinkling outside her window. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages of support from colleagues, updates from the command center, and articles dissecting the day's press conference. The weight of the day pressed down on her, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. Progress was slow, but it was happening. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Supervisory Agent Wallace. She answered, leaning back in her chair. "Rebecca," Wallace said, his tone warmer than usual, "I wanted to let you know that the mayor's office has agreed to your proposal for an independent review. They're assembling a task force, and they've asked if you'd be willing to serve as an advisor." Rebecca's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'd be honored." "Good," Wallace said, "but be prepared. It's going to be a fight. There's already pushback from the union and certain factions within the department." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Rebecca replied. "But I didn't join the FBI to back down from a fight." As she hung up, Rebecca gazed out at the city. This was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But she was ready. For every person who had been silenced, for every injustice that had been overlooked, she would fight. The waves of accountability had begun, and Rebecca Carter was determined to ensure they didn't stop until they reached the shore. The battle lines drawn. The next few days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. The Independent Review Task Force was assembled swiftly, bringing together a mix of federal agents, local leaders, community activists, and legal experts. Its mandate was clear: to identify systemic issues within the Philadelphia Police Department and recommend actionable reforms. Rebecca Carter, as an advisor, found herself thrust into the center of a growing movement. For every voice demanding justice, another resisted change, creating a volatile battleground of ideologies. The Philadelphia skyline loomed outside the task force's temporary headquarters, an unassuming government building tucked away from the media frenzy. Inside, tension simmered. The first full meeting of the task force had attracted more attention than anticipated. Representatives from the police union, community organizations, and city officials filled the room. The air crackled with energy, some hopeful, others hostile. Rebecca entered the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. Dressed sharply in her Navy suit, her FBI badge clipped prominently to her blazer, she moved with a quiet authority that silenced murmurs. Supervisory Agent Wallace was already seated at the far end of the table, nodding to her as she took her place beside him. At the head of the room stood Mayor Evelyn Hart, her expression a careful balance of determination and diplomacy. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice measured. "The incident involving Agent Carter has cast a spotlight on our city, and we now face an opportunity and an obligation to make lasting change." The mayor's words hung in the air as the room braced for the inevitable clash of perspectives. Rebecca scanned the faces around her. Some were familiar allies, like Lieutenant Naomi Clark from Internal Affairs, who had taken the lead on Officer Mitchell's investigation. Others were more adversarial, like Chief of Police Donald Graves, whose stone-faced demeanor betrayed a simmering resentment. "Before we proceed," Mayor Hart continued, "I want to remind everyone that this task force is not about placing blame but about finding solutions. We are here to work together." Rebecca could sense the skepticism from certain corners of the room, particularly from Chief Graves and a handful of uniformed officers seated near him. Their crossed arms and narrowed eyes spoke volumes. Still, Rebecca remained calm. She had faced greater resistance before and knew the importance of staying composed. The first point of discussion was inevitable. Officer Mitchell. Lieutenant Clark stood, her notepad in hand, and presented her preliminary findings. As of today, Officer Paul Mitchell has been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Internal Affairs has uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior in his record, including multiple complaints of racial profiling and unwarranted stops. These complaints were either dismissed due to insufficient evidence or ignored outright. The room stirred, murmurs rising among the attendees. Chief Graves leaned forward, his voice sharp. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, we're basing this on an isolated incident that went viral. Mitchell's record may not be spotless, but he's served this department for 20 years. Rebecca's voice cut through the rising tension, calm but unyielding. "Chief Graves, this isn't just about one incident or one officer. Officer Mitchell's actions are indicative of a larger problem, a culture that enables bias and discourages accountability." Graves turned to her, his expression hardening. "With all due respect, Agent Carter, you're an outsider. You don't understand the pressures our officers face every day. They're out there risking their lives, and split-second decisions don't always look perfect under a microscope." Rebecca met his gaze, her tone steady. "I understand the challenges your officers face, Chief, but I also understand that their authority comes with responsibility. Protecting and serving doesn't mean profiling and intimidating." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Mayor Hart intervened, her voice firm but conciliatory. "Let's refocus. We're here to address systemic issues, not trade blame. Lieutenant Clark, please continue." Clark nodded and resumed, detailing how Officer Mitchell's behavior had been enabled by a lack of oversight. "Our review has revealed that complaints were often mishandled, with no formal tracking system in place. Supervisors failed to take corrective action, allowing problematic behavior to persist." Rebecca seized the moment. "This is why transparency is key. Every stop, every complaint, every use of force must be documented and reviewed independently. Without oversight, we're just repeating the same mistakes." The discussion turned to solutions, and Rebecca found herself at the center of the debate. One of the most contentious proposals was the creation of an independent oversight board composed of civilians, legal experts, and community representatives. The board would have the authority to review complaints, investigate misconduct, and recommend disciplinary action. Predictably, the police union representatives pushed back hard. "You're talking about putting officers' careers in the hands of people who don't understand the realities of policing," one union official argued. "It's not fair to judge us based on hindsight." Rebecca responded calmly but firmly. "This isn't about judging officers unfairly. It's about ensuring accountability. If an officer has nothing to hide, they have nothing to fear from oversight." Another officer, seated beside Chief Graves, leaned forward. "And what about officers who hesitate because they're afraid of being second-guessed? You're creating a culture of fear." Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. "The only officers who should fear accountability are the ones who know they've done something wrong. Hesitation comes from poor training, not from oversight." The exchange underscored the divide in the room. On one side were those demanding transparency and reform. On the other were those defending the status quo. But Rebecca knew that the tide of public opinion was on her side, and she intended to use it. As the meeting stretched into its third hour, tempers flared but progress began to emerge. Mayor Hart proposed a pilot program for body cameras, mandatory for all officers on patrol, with the footage stored and reviewed independently. The suggestion received tentative support, though some officers grumbled about privacy concerns. Rebecca advocated for more comprehensive bias training, not just as a one-time event, but as an ongoing requirement. "Training isn't just about checking a box," she said. "It's about reshaping the way officers think and act in the field. That requires commitment." By the end of the meeting, a tentative framework had been established, but the real work was just beginning. As the attendees dispersed, Rebecca lingered in the conference room, her thoughts racing. Supervisory Agent Wallace approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. "Thanks," Rebecca replied. "But it's clear we're up against a lot of resistance." Wallace nodded. "That's to be expected. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges people's power and comfort." Rebecca sighed, her resolve hardening. "We can't let them stall this. Every day we delay, more people are subjected to the same treatment I faced, or worse. Wallace placed a hand on her shoulder. You've already started something big, Rebecca. Now we just have to see it through. That evening, Rebecca returned to her apartment, exhausted but unable to rest. She scrolled through social media, where videos of the task force meeting had already begun circulating. Public support for reform was strong, but so was the backlash. Comment sections were a battleground of opinions, with some praising her courage and others accusing her of undermining law enforcement. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ryan Cole. Officer Cole, Agent Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. Standing up in that meeting today wasn't easy, but you made me realize it's the right thing to do. I'm committed to being part of the solution. Rebecca smiled faintly and replied, Agent Carter, thank you, Officer Cole. It takes courage to speak out, and your voice matters. Let's keep pushing for change, together. As she set her phone down, Rebecca felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle lines were drawn, but she was ready. This wasn't just about one officer, one stop, or one city. It was about dismantling a system of injustice and building something better in its place. The fight had only just begun. The road to redemption. The weeks following the task force's first meeting were a blur of action. The city of Philadelphia had become a crucible for change, a testing ground for what true accountability could look like. Meetings stretched into the night, debates grew heated, and the pressure from the public didn't waver. Rebecca Carter, at the heart of it all, worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. The day began early in the Philadelphia Police Department's headquarters, where Rebecca had been invited to observe the first round of mandatory training sessions. These sessions, a direct result of the task force's recommendations, were designed to address implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and community engagement. Every officer was required to attend. From rookies to seasoned veterans, the training facilitator, a respected expert in law enforcement reform, stood at the front of a packed room. Officers sat in rows, some engaged and others visibly resistant. Rebecca sat quietly in the back, observing their reactions. Let's talk about bias, the facilitator began, his voice firm but approachable. Not the kind you know you have, the kind you don't even realize influences your decisions. It's the split-second judgment you make about someone based on their appearance, their behavior, or where they are. Rebecca's gaze shifted to Officer Ryan Cole, seated near the front. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, but his posture suggested he was still grappling with the events of the past weeks. Further back, a cluster of senior officers, including some who had openly opposed the task force, leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. Their expressions ranged from indifference to outright hostility. The facilitator continued, Every officer in this room has made a biased decision at some point. That doesn't make you a bad person, but it does mean you have a responsibility to recognize and address it. Bias unchecked can lead to consequences far beyond a single incident. Rebecca saw a ripple of discomfort move through the room. Some officers shifted in their seats, while others avoided eye contact. The facilitator's words were hitting their mark, though not everyone was willing to acknowledge it. After the session, Rebecca approached Ryan, who was gathering his notes. He looked up as she neared, his expression a mix of respect and uncertainty. Agent Carter, he said, nodding. Did you think it went well? Rebecca smiled faintly. It's a start. These conversations are uncomfortable, but they're necessary. What did you think? Ryan hesitated, then sighed. I think a lot of us have more to learn than we're willing to admit. I know I do. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder. Acknowledging that is the first step, Officer Cole. The real question is what you'll do with it. He nodded, his resolve hardening. I want to do better. I want to make a difference. Meanwhile, across town, Supervisory Agent Wallace was meeting with Internal Affairs officers to discuss the findings of their investigation into Officer Mitchell. Lieutenant Naomi Clark presented a comprehensive report that painted a damning picture. Mitchell had a history of targeting minority drivers, making stops under the guise of suspicious behavior. Complaints had been filed, but the department's lack of oversight allowed the pattern to persist. "This is more than just Mitchell," Clark said, her tone grim. "The same patterns are showing up across multiple precincts. This isn't an isolated problem. It's systemic." Wallace leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "What's the next step?" Clark didn't hesitate. "Disciplinary action for the officers involved, starting with Mitchell. But that's just the beginning. We need a complete overhaul of how complaints are handled, from the moment they're filed to the final resolution." Wallace nodded. "And what about transparency? The public won't trust us unless they see concrete results." Clark flipped a page in her report. "We're recommending quarterly public reports detailing the outcomes of complaints, use of force incidents, and disciplinary actions. It's going to ruffle feathers, but it's necessary." Rebecca sat in the FBI field office later that day, reading through the initial drafts of the task force's reform proposals. The documents outlined ambitious changes: the creation of an independent oversight board, mandatory transparency reports, body camera implementation, and enhanced training programs. It was a blueprint for transformation, but Rebecca knew it would face significant resistance. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Ryan Cole. "Officer Cole, Agent Carter, I need your advice. Chief Graves asked to meet with me. Should I go?" Rebecca considered her response carefully. She knew Graves had been one of the most vocal critics of the task force and suspected his intentions were more about damage control than genuine dialogue. "Agent Carter, yes, go, but stay true to your principles. If he tries to pressure you, remind him that integrity isn't negotiable." Ryan's response came quickly. "Officer Cole, got it. Thanks, Agent Carter." Rebecca set the phone down, her thoughts lingering on the rookie officer. Ryan represented a new generation of law enforcement, one that could embrace change instead of resisting it. He was proof that reform was possible, even within a system as entrenched as policing. The meeting with Chief Graves took place in his spacious office, its walls adorned with commendations and framed photos of him with city officials. Ryan entered hesitantly, his nerves evident. Graves gestured for him to sit, his expression unreadable. "Cole," Graves began, his voice steady, "I've been watching you closely these past few weeks. You've made quite a name for yourself." Ryan shifted in his seat. "I'm just trying to do the right thing, sir." Graves leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "That's admirable, but let me give you some advice. The people you work with, they're your family. You don't turn your back on family." Ryan's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, I'm not turning my back on anyone. I'm holding myself to the same standard I expect from my colleagues." Graves's expression hardened. "And you think siding with the task force is the way to do that?" "Let me tell you something, Cole. Reform is a nice idea, but out there on the streets, it's a different story. The rules don't always apply the way they do in a meeting room." Ryan met Graves's gaze, his voice steady. "If the rules don't apply, then we're not doing our jobs right. I became a cop to protect and serve, not to look the other way." Graves leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're idealistic, Cole. That's going to get you in trouble." Ryan stood, his resolve firm. "If doing the right thing gets me in trouble, then so be it." The ripple effects of Ryan's stance and Rebecca's unyielding determination began to spread. Community leaders who had long been skeptical of law enforcement started attending task force meetings, their voices adding depth to the conversation. Officers like Ryan began advocating for reforms from within, challenging their peers to rethink outdated practices. The Independent Oversight Board was officially established, its members carefully chosen to represent diverse perspectives. Rebecca was asked to chair its inaugural meeting, a responsibility she accepted with quiet pride. As she addressed the board, Rebecca spoke from the heart. "This isn't just about fixing a broken system. It's about building something better. It's about creating a culture of accountability, where trust isn't just earned but actively maintained. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. And it starts here, with us. The room erupted in applause, the first step in a long journey toward redemption. Months later, Rebecca stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of reporters and citizens. The reforms were in motion, and the city was already seeing the impact. Complaints against officers were down, community engagement was up, and transparency had become the norm. "This isn't the end," Rebecca said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is the beginning of something bigger, a movement toward justice, accountability, and trust. We still have work to do, but together, we can make it happen." As the crowd cheered, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. The road to redemption was long, but it was a road worth traveling, and she was ready for every step ahead.